So thank you very much, Dr. Bialystok, for being with us to talk about the cognitive benefits of multilingualism. So just to introduce you briefly, you're a distinguished research professor of psychology at York University and associate scientist at the Rotman Research Institute of Baycrest. And you have conducted extensive research on the effect of bilingualism or the bilingual experience on the cognitive ability across the lifespan, so from infancy to older age. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to add to your introduction?
No, maybe I'll add that you've accurately described what I've researched over the past several decades, but where my interest now is in trying to understand and explain the results of that research to families and teachers and educators and people more generally. Why should this matter in people's lives?
Okay, and this is why, I guess, why you wrote this book.
It is
which is with loads of research, very interesting book. I'm going to leave the link in the description below for those of you who are interested. And so we're going to talk about a few things that I found really interesting in this book. And I hope we're going to bust some myths as well about multilingualism and what does it mean, what does the bilingual, what do bilingual benefits are in terms of cognitively. So I would like to start maybe by one research that you mentioned in your book that I found really interesting. And you were talking about children who attend a bilingual program. So there are children who are monolingual English when they start and those who are bilingual. And the research stated that after a few years, those who are bilingual, so speaking English and another language generally at home, outperformed children who are monolingual, but in English. That really surprised me because logically, I would think, okay, people who are bilingual, they speak another language, so they have less time to perfect the English. Why do you think there is this difference? Where does it come from?
Well, I think the more interesting outcome of that study, if I may, is not where their English scores were, because everybody's English scores were just fine. They all knew enough English. Their English scores were all in the normal range, no matter what else they were. So that was all okay. The more interesting, I think, was that after 3 years, not right away, but after 3 years, children who spoke something else at home had learned more French. Now, none of the children spoke French when they started the program. So the difference is between kids who spoke only English and came into the French immersion program and kids who spoke something else at home that was never French and learned English in the community and came into the French immersion program. They all started with no French.
Okay.
But after 3 years, the kids who also knew another language had learned more French. And I think that's an important finding. So, they're kind of plodding along learning this language, and eventually it kind of coalesces better for the kids who are also speaking another language.
Okay. And do you think it's because they have like two models to use to learn a third language? Is that because they are already starting to see some patterns and differences that they can spot them better in the third language, or is it something completely
different? It's possible. It could be something as simple as they're less afraid of language. People are afraid of language. Parents are afraid of language. This is why you get parents all concerned about whether it would be okay if their kid were exposed to another language. People are afraid of languages. And I think the kids who have experience because they speak something else at home and they speak English at soccer practice and they go to school and they speak French, it's just no big deal.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
it could be something as simple as that. We don't have an explanation, but it actually makes sense to
Yeah, so
me.
it can be psychological more than anything
It could
else
be.
then.
Yeah.
Okay. And one thing I thought about when I read this study is, so uh, there are some children who are bilingual and they study both their languages in school. So here, for example, French was studied in school and English as well. Is there, no, sorry.
No. In these programs, in these very specific French immersion programs, in the early years that we did our research, school is only in French. Now, the kids go out for recess and lunch playground activities, and they speak English to each other because they can. Their French is not very good.
Yeah.
This is also
No,
another
no.
misconception, okay, I'll just send my kid to French immersion program and after a year or two, they'll speak French. No, they won't. So their French is not really very good, but they're not studying English in school. They're only studying French in school.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that's a good precision to make. Thank you. And so I had a probably very naive question, but from my perspective, I think so. When we speak a language, one language, our brain works. When we speak two languages, you said there are cognitive benefits. Do these benefits augment if we speak two very different languages? Or for the brain, it doesn't matter if it's two very similar languages or two very different languages?
Now, I'm going to give you a long answer because it's a
Yes.
question many people ask.
Yeah.
It's also a question that people have done research on. And I can tell you that the research results go both ways. And I can make up a really good story about why there should be more benefits if the languages are similar. And equally, I could make up a story about why there should be more benefits if the languages are different. So I'm going to say it doesn't matter. And in order to explain that, I want to talk a little bit about why anything changes. Now, if you think about it, there's nothing about this bilingualism and cognitive and brain story that should be surprising. Everybody's surprised by it, but there's nothing that should be surprising. And the reason is our brains develop and work and function and change in the environment in which they are placed.
Yeah.
So whatever your brain is required to do, it will adapt. Now, it turns out that speaking two languages requires some adjustments in how the brain usually functions. And the main reason is a surprising one, but there's just tons of evidence supporting this fact. And that is, if you're able to speak two languages or more languages, those languages are always active in your brain. There isn't a switch. Okay, now I'm speaking English now. There is no switch.
Yeah.
And that means the bilingual mind and brain has to do something to deal with this potential constant interference. It has to adapt. A monolingual brain doesn't have to adapt that way. So the bilingual mind and brain adjusts. And what we see then is that in the bilingual mind and brain, the regions of the brain and the cognitive processes that are responsible for pay attention to this, ignore that, or just focus on this. No, don't let that in. Those kinds of things, these very ordinary selective attention things that you use all the time, when you're driving on a highway, when you walk into a supermarket, wherever you are, you're always trying to focus on this and ignore that. The bilingual mind has to do it all the time. And that means the bilingual mind is slightly different. And the most remarkable thing that we have found and others have reported the same result, is that if you take a brand new baby, doesn't speak a word, and put these babies in an environment where there's only one language around, or an environment where there are two languages around, the baby in the first year of life who doesn't say a word will have different processes of attention because they understand the complexity of two kinds of linguistic environments. So it's just what brains do. And because language is essential to who we are and how we communicate, having two languages means your brains are constantly being required to adapt, to adjust. So we shouldn't be surprised that bilingual brains are different, or bilingual cognitive processes are sometimes different on certain kinds of tasks where attention is required.
So when we talk about cognitive benefits, there is the attention span or the focus. What are the other benefits? I guess it's different.
You see, I don't like the
lifespan.
question because it's too reductive. You know, the people who argue against this research do so by reducing it to a simple category. Okay, bilingualism, that means you're bilingual or you're not bilingual, is has an advantage, a benefit, maybe for cognition. What kind of cognition? It's too reductionist. There is no prototypical bilingual, and the nuances of bilingual experience matter a lot. There is no simple class of tasks for which bilinguals always have some kind of advantage or benefit. That doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
All we know is that aspects of being bilingual modify performance on certain kinds of tasks and change certain aspects of brain wiring. We know that for sure. But none of that can be captured by bilinguals are better at X or Y. That's too reductive.
Okay, thank you very much for the clarification. I would like to talk about maybe different, no. Before that, maybe talking more about, actually, we can talk about different fears that I hear, because you just explained that the point of view needs to be a bit different. So some of the myths we hear a lot are the things that are happening, and I would like to know your answer. So if, for example, a family wants to pass on different languages, so let's say 3-4 languages on top of the school language, I would think that at some point there is some kind of overwhelm, cognitive overwhelm. And so for the people who are planning to pass on multiple languages, what would you say? What would be your advice?
I would say every day has 24 hours in it, and there's nothing you can do to change that. The way kids learn languages is through the amount of exposure and practice they have with each language. So if a kid is only required to learn one language, then all of their available time for learning language is devoted to that language. Okay. If a kid has to learn 2 languages, they have to now divide the time. And remember, the most important factor, in how well you learn a language is how much time you spend learning it. So if you divide the time between 2 languages, turns out that still works pretty well.
Yeah.
What about dividing it between 3 languages? Whoa, it's a little bit hairy. 4 languages? Nobody's got that much time. And I've heard anecdotally from so many families who say, okay, you know, we live in country X, my native language is Y, my wife's native language is Z. See, I'm Canadian, not American, it's Z. My wife's native language is Z. So we're going to give our children all 3 languages, right? And they set out with all the best intentions, and the household has all 3 languages. That's for the first child, and they're exhausted, and then they have a second language, as a second child. And for the second child, they say, well, maybe Z isn't so important, so we'll just focus on X and Y and so on. So what you see happening here is that the overload is only about time. You need enough time to learn language. You need enough time to actually support and use the language, read the child's stories in all the languages. And once you start dividing it up into too many slices, you just run out of time.
Yeah, I see that in my family, I'm French Japanese. My wife is Korean. We live in the UK, and so for various reasons. But I chose to pass on just French. And when I learned that it was possible to, like, some people were passing on 2 languages, one parent, 2 languages, I thought, okay, already it's taking me so much time and effort to pass on 1 language. Am I able to do that with 2 languages? So I think, yeah, it's for the child already, it's a lot, but also for the parents, it can be quite a lot.
I think that's exactly the point. It's just too much. And families, I mean, what holds a busy family together is communication. And you just want to say what's on your mind. You don't want every interaction to be a language class. You just want to say what you need to say. You want to manage your kids. You want to get dinner on the table. You want everybody to brush their teeth at night. It's too much to worry about what language this is all happening in if you're in a busy family. So 2 languages are fine. Beyond that, I think, as you personally know, it gets
So and we need to think of the time we have to dedicate to that, the time our children have, because we probably want them to do tennis, piano, whatever. So
exactly. And you know very well, you also need to read them stories at night. You know that. So, like, do you have 6 libraries? Here are the Korean books, here are the Japanese. You don't. You know, you have a few favorite stories and so on. So it's not a cognitive limitation, it's a practical limitation.
okay, thank you very much. And okay, another myth, or not myth actually, something that's actually happened to some of my friends. When a teacher tells parents, you shouldn't speak your home language to your child because they are already delayed, they don't speak enough English, so you should stop it so they are more exposed to English. What would you say to a teacher who says that to parents?
Well, first I'd say read my book. Second, I would say, to me, this is the biggest problem right now, the most critical, urgent issue in bilingual education, bilingualism and education, teacher training around bilingualism.
Yeah.
It's based on an enormous misconception, and it's harmful. It's very harmful. So you've got two things you have to keep separate here. We're talking about bilingualism in terms of these kids who go to bilingual programs like French immersion.
Yeah.
And we're also talking about bilingualism in terms of kids who are in families where there's more than 1 language, or the family language is different from the school. These are different, separate cases. So let me just deal quickly with the first one. If you have a child who comes from a completely monolingual English home, who has been sent to French immersion because the parents thought this would be a good opportunity, but the child is struggling or is unhappy or is not making good progress, I say, so take them out, make a different choice. It doesn't matter, really.
Yeah.
But if you have a child who speaks a language at home because that's the family language, and a different language at school because that's the community language, this is not a choice, this is a responsibility.
Yeah.
And you cannot go to a family, and say, stop speaking to your child in your language, he's looking confused in school. It's a terrible thing to do to families, to children. And in terms of educational outcomes, it's simply wrong. Some children indeed have learning disabilities or language disabilities that makes them struggle in school. And some of these children also come from homes where English is not the family language.
Yeah.
But the advice is the same. So as my friend and colleague Kathy Carnert says in her book on multilingual children, if you take a bilingual child with a learning disability and you take away one of the languages, you know what you're left with? A monolingual child with a learning disability.
Yeah.
It's all subtraction. There's no benefit in this. The learning disability doesn't go away. The child will still need educational support, but they will have lost something fundamental: their identity, their culture, their language, their ability to speak to their grandparents or their aunts and uncles, to travel to their ancestral homeland.
Yeah.
That's a far greater
Impact.
problem
Yeah.
than maybe I need some educational support in school.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it can have a much bigger impact than what teachers might think
Yeah.
originally.
And again, you know what, this example you raised is so common, and that's why I'm so passionate about answering it, because it all comes down to what I said earlier. These people mean well. The teachers, the physicians say this, clinicians say this, school psychologists, they all say it. And they say it because they're afraid of language. That's all it comes down to. And they don't understand the role of language in these families.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a very important thing to highlight. We have a question from, I think, someone you know. It's Ute Limacher-Ribolt. She's asking which cognitive advantages of knowing several languages have a positive effect on learning to read in different languages.
Okay, right. So reading is complicated, right? Reading is not automatic. And reading is interesting because it's a linguistic activity and a cognitive activity, and it requires educational support. It brings a lot of stuff together. So we need to figure out what you mean by reading. So if you mean reading in two languages that are written in the same writing system and the same script. So writing systems and scripts are different.
Yeah.
Writing system is, what's the rule for encoding? Is it letters are written down or syllables are written down? And you know, as somebody who knows Japanese and English and French, you're familiar with all of that, right? Across these languages. Yeah. Sometimes it's a syllable, sometimes it's a morpheme, sometimes it's a phoneme. So different written languages have different rules about those things. That's the writing system. And learning how a writing system works is a cognitive activity. It's all cognitive. It's all about learning these rules, using working memory to apply these rules, and so on. Now, within writing systems, there are scripts. For example, in an alphabetic writing system, you can write in Roman letters or Cyrillic letters. Within a morphemic system, you can write in kanji, or in Chinese, you could write in simplified characters or traditional. There's variations within the writing system, and it has to be learned. Yeah. So what we're talking about when we're talking about learning to read, we need to know how much of the actual mechanics of reading are different from the language the child already reads in. And that's a cognitive problem. So the more different it is, the more cognitive apparatus gets engaged to learn that system and then practice it and have that become an automatic fluent ability as well. So there's many cognitive components to reading, and how it relates to learning to read in other languages depends on the relationships between the writing systems and the scripts.
Okay, so am I understanding well in saying that if you're learning two languages that have the same writing system, let's say French and English, so the cognitive process is the same, but if it's Japanese and or Chinese and English, it's like learning twice.
Yes, that's right. And it's even more complicated than that, because even if it's the same writing system and the same script, let's say English and Spanish,
Yeah.
then you get into differences in orthography. So Spanish is perfectly transparent.
Yeah.
Just say the letters and you got it. English
Yeah.
is not transparent. So even there, everything should line up. There's still differences. So reading is a big deal, and it's hard.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I would like to carry on with one more thing that I hear a lot around. It's the fear of our children losing their language. So in many families, so for example, I'm living in England, and when I speak to my sons in French, sometimes they reply to me in French, but sometimes in English. And for example, last summer we went to France, but before that it had been 3 years, and they were speaking a lot in English back to me. And so some parents might be a bit scared, thinking they're going to lose their language. So that's my first question. Can we lose a language if we don't use it? And also, what was my question? Oh yeah, if our children doesn't reply, so he hears a lot our languages, but he doesn't reply, does it mean that cognitively the brain makes less efforts? And so there are less
So
benefits?
let's do these questions one at a time, okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Because they're really separate questions. I mean, kids who are
Yeah.
at risk of losing their language sometimes refuse to speak the heritage language to their parents. That's because kids are inherently stubborn and self-centered, and it's because they're kids, right? That's what they do. They want to be like their friends. They don't want to speak this funny thing that my parent, eye rolling stuff. So kids do that. Let's deal with that second one first, okay? So you're living in a place where let's simplify your situation. Let's say at home you only speak French. Kids go to school, they only speak English. Their French is perfectly fine, but they go through a stage where they start refusing to speak French. They don't like to speak French. I think that's just kids being kids. What you do there is you continue speaking French. Don't make it a big deal. Accept any answer that they come up with. As long as your kids are talking to you, you've won some kind of a battle. Who cares what the language is? So I think that's normal, and it's okay, and it's what kids do, but their language is there, and you don't need to worry about it. Another aspect of that you didn't ask about, but I'll just add on. Yeah. This idea of mixing languages in the family. Oh my God, I slipped into English and he expects me. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There's this idea of a rule, one parent, one language, don't ever break the rule. There's no evidence for that. Keep the languages alive in the family, make them part of the conversation. It really doesn't matter who speaks what. You can change in the middle of a sentence. It doesn't matter as long as the languages are there. So that's the easy question, okay? Yeah. Right, so you're always speaking, there's always a presence in the home of French. No matter who's speaking it or not speaking it, it's an active part. But now you're asking a different question. And what if that language suddenly isn't used? It's a language we only use when we went to visit our family in France, and then there was this pandemic, nobody went anywhere, kids didn't hear French. So here you're right, kids can lose languages. And adults lose languages. This happens. If you don't speak the language all the time, you lose the language. It's real. But the interesting thing is you never lose it down to zero. So there's two studies on the question of people who were adopted as infants or children, brought to a new country, and then never heard the language again. So the first study, kind of funny results. It looked at Korean infants being adopted to France and growing up with French. And the study tried to find out if there was any residual Korean in their brains. And the results were kind of, no, I don't think so. But a second study used a far more sensitive technique. And this was a study done in Montreal, Canada. And this time it looked at Chinese infants and children who were adopted to Canada, grew up speaking only French or only English. I can't remember, but no more Chinese, right?
Yeah.
So here's the interesting thing they did in this study. Now, they obviously didn't know any Chinese. They'd heard it for the first year or two of their lives, maybe 3 years of their lives. They never spoke Chinese, and so on. But as I said earlier, everything that your brain has to do changes your brain. Everything your brain has to process leaves a mark on your brain. It changes your brain. So let's say you're put in an environment where the language is Chinese. It's the first language you hear. You grow up listening to Chinese. You're not in the environment long enough to become a fluent speaker of Chinese, but your brain is being shaped around Chinese.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, here's the thing. Chinese is one of those really interesting languages that uses tone as meaningful. It's morphological. So when you're listening to Chinese, tone is giving you linguistic information, and so it's processed in the left hemisphere along with all other aspects of language. If you've never really been immersed in Chinese, tone is just kind of annoying or not even noticeable. It's not part of the language signal.
Yeah.
So they take all of these now adults who have this background, who know not a word of Chinese, not a word, but spent up to 3 or so years as infants and children in China. And they hook them up to brain imaging machines.
Yeah.
And they also hook up control groups of people who have never had any experience in Chinese. So let's start with the control group. These are young adults who grew up speaking English or French. Hook them up, okay, play words to them in English or French. What is their brain doing? Well, all of this activity in the left hemisphere lights up, blah, 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 blah. And the same thing with these adopted children.
Yeah.
Now you take the same groups and you play Chinese words with tones. Where is the tone processed?
Yeah.
And for the control group, tone is processed in the right hemisphere. It's just sort of musical spatial information. So all of the tonal signals are processed in the right hemisphere. For the adopted people, it's in the left hemisphere, just like any native speaker of Chinese. So their brain changed. That first experience in which their brain was getting wired to understand language happened in a context where tone information was linguistic, and so it's processed in the left, even when it's not needed for the language they go on to speak. So, for all of these reasons, you can see that every experience has its own impact.
Yeah.
And these experiences, they change the way the brain is wired.
Yeah.
So all of this research is as well, we took a bunch of people into the lab, and half of them we called monolingual and half of them we called bilingual. And then we gave them some cognitive task where they had to press buttons and there was no difference. So there's no difference between monolinguals and bilinguals because they all press these buttons at the same time. That is to completely miss the point of what's happening here. We don't become bilingual because we want people to do these tasks, 50 milliseconds faster. That would be ridiculous. These tasks are one kind of a window on how this language experience has changed the brain. It's changed the way it's wired, and in some cases, it changes structural features as well.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Just for the Chinese people who were in China 1, 2, 3 years and then didn't speak it at all. So you said the information was processed differently in the brain, but I'm guessing that the brain is more receptive to the meaning of tones, for example, as meaningful. But does it mean that they can learn Chinese more easily, or is it's going to be the same difficulty because the grammar is different and the words are different?
It's a great question, and I can only tell you my guess is
Yeah.
that they would learn Chinese more easily. I think that, that's why I say, you can lose language, but it never goes down to zero.
Yeah.
And I think that whatever is left is a base, and that would be my prediction, that they would learn Chinese more easily. Any language that you had previous exposure to would be easier to reinstall.
That's really encouraging, because to all the parents who speak their home language and they see their children just use the school language and being like, but my child is not going to speak. It's even if they don't speak now, it means that their brain is receiving the information, is getting modified through it, but later on, if they wish to, it's going to be a lot easier.
I would think that's true. I would agree with that.
Okay, that's really insightful. Thank you very much. I see that we're close to the end, but I was wondering, so we talked about various things that people might think that are not true, etc. Is there one final thought you would like to talk about that we haven't maybe covered, that you think is important for parents and teachers to know about?
Well, maybe this, there's so much talk about whether bilingualism helps cognition, hurts cognition. Is the research showing cognitive differences true or false or fake or real? There's so much fuss about that. And I think that's not really the point. Language is communication, identity, culture. We need to learn languages to be better humans, to be better connected to who we are, to give us access to how other people think and feel and work and love and hate. It gives us access to humanity. The point about bilingualism is access to other minds. And if you can do a Stroop task 50 milliseconds faster, I just can't imagine getting excited about it, let alone arguing about it the way some people have taken to recently. It doesn't matter. You learn languages are fundamental to human existence, and more languages gives you more insights and more access. And I think that should be the goal. We want our children to learn languages, not only the languages of our own ancestors, but also languages that will help them understand the human condition.
Wow. Thank you very much, especially coming from someone who did research in cognition, saying that we need to care more about what it brings to the individual. It's really, it's nice to hear. And I guess there are going to be many parents who are going to feel a bit more relaxed, because when we raise multilingual children, I guess we are so caught on like all these maybe superficial things, such as how much they speak, how well they speak, and all these data. And yeah, so we need to see the child as an individual and what it brings to that individual at a personal level, not necessarily in the brain, but at a personal level.
Yeah.
Wow.
I agree.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, we had, oh, okay. No, just someone who's saying, thank you for the great questions and information. Yeah, it's really insightful. I'm so glad you're here to share all this, but you have done research and you have maybe a bird's eye view on the situation, so that me as a parent, I feel more relaxed. I'm sure it's going to be the same for many people. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.